According to the June 2026 voter sentiment tracker by SBM Intelligence, President Bola Tinubu faces a steep path to the 2027 re-election, recording a net favorability score of minus 58.5%. Nearly 80% of surveyed Nigerians state the country is heading in the wrong direction, driven by crippling inflation and insecurity. Conversely, opposition leader Peter Obi enters the race with a positive net favorability of plus 58.3%, lifting the NDC coalition to a 57.4% national lead over the ruling APC's 11.3%. However, analysts note the opposition's success hinges on a high turnout scenario, rendering the southwest and northeast pivotal in the highly contested or being the biggest swing zones. To unpack this, I'm joined by Ikemesit Effiong, partner SBM Intelligence. Thank you for coming today, Ikemesit.
Thank you very much for having me, Perpetua.
Okay, so I'm just going to look at the numbers. How representative is an 829 sample survey for projecting national electoral dynamics in a country the size of Nigeria? I wanted us to start with the methodology, how you went about this particular survey. That
makes sense, and I get asked this question all the time.
Yeah.
So the approach that we adopted is referred to as a dipstick survey approach, right? Yeah. So this survey was conducted in 8 Nigerian states as well as the Federal Capital Territory. All of these states are representative of each of their geopolitical zones. So all of the geopolitical zones, right, were surveyed. And these states represent the states that we have been collecting a lot of socioeconomic cost of living inflation data for the better part of 13, 14 years. Now, as you very well know, you're familiar with our Jollof Index reports. We've been on the show several times to discuss it. So these are our quote-unquote Jollof Index states, as it were. So what we wanted to do was just to get a very early snapshot of the headspace and the thinking of the likely Nigerian voter, right? It's a bit early in the election cycle. The primaries have only just wrapped up across all of the major political parties, of course. So with all of the dynamics around defections, cross-carpeting, the various suits that have been going through the judicial system, trying to figure out who is a legitimate, right, aspirant and otherwise, right, we felt now was a good time just to get that first initial reading from the Nigerian voter about how they're thinking about the state of the country, how they're thinking about the economy, and how they're thinking about the political decision makers who are shaping those dynamics. And we felt that, a small indicative number which is paired to the demographic breakdown of each of these states. So we tried to mirror the demographic breakdown as we know them from, MBS data, right? Also having a very, very obvious bias towards those who have their either have their PVCs or have voted in past election cycles, but for some reason or the other have not yet collected PVCs, which will render them eligible to vote in this cycle. We just wanted to have a sense of what they were.
Oh, that's interesting. I like what you said about it's just like an initial step. You're taking another step. You're going to be having another anytime soon. But don't answer that. Now, your survey shows that President Tinubu's average policy rating across inflation, tax, security, jobs, and power sits below 2.02 out of 4 across all regions. Now, given that 80% of respondents believe Nigeria is headed in the wrong direction, is there any, viable economic path for this administration to sort of reverse what's currently happening before the 2027 election?
Well, unless they do something miraculous, right? I don't know that right now there is much necessarily that the government can do. The thing is, the government has done very good work in terms of taking some of the hard steps in driving necessary reform around fuel, around the fuel subsidy program, around assuring currency stability.
But that exactly is why, Nigerians are complaining. That was what plunged Nigerians into this inflation we're talking about now, coupled with the war, which might end soon.
Yes, correct. And I was getting to that, which is that, right, the government has done great work, right, in that respect. But there appears to be a disconnect, like some of the flow-through effects, right, or some of the early flow-through effects of those reforms has obviously been, right, a raging cost of living crisis. Everything is a lot higher. Everything is a lot more expensive now. And that's what the Nigerian voter is feeling at a very visceral level in their pockets, in the bills that come through every month, in rent, in transportation, right, and the likes. Like you've rightly pointed out, some of the drivers, right, of these price increases are outside of the government's control. The government wasn't the one, for example, who started up a conflict in the Middle East. The government is not the one, right?
Well, before the conflict, the government made a pronouncement that, you know, ensured that this inflation cycle started. Now, the point is the government able to probably address this from the fiscal perspective? Because from the monetary perspective, we see a lot of things going on. But from the fiscal perspective, do you think the government is doing enough to address all of these things?
Well, I think what I would have loved to see the government do more, right, would have been more in terms of well-designed social protection programs, especially for the most vulnerable, right, lower income households in Nigeria. A lot more work should have gone into, for example, beefing up and investing in our agricultural extension, right, programs, which would ensure that farmers, which still accounts for the overwhelming share of Nigeria's workforce, are well supported. I also don't think the government has done enough in terms of housing reform and essentially expanding the housing stock for lower and middle income Nigerians. It seems as though the higher end of the property market is well served by the private sector, but not enough tax or regulatory incentives exist to incentivize building, right, for the lower income demographics. So there are a couple of things that the government, right, could have done over the path of this administration that would have cushioned some of the worst effects, right, of this inflationary crisis. Now, we are what, 7 months out or so from the national elections. All of those things are not going to happen in 7 months. In fact, very little governance, right, will happen, right, over the next couple of months. So the way we see our reports and the way we see the data on what Nigerian voters are saying is basically for the government to get a quantitative sense of how voters are thinking and what either for the current administration, what a likely second-term program, right, of action would look like, or for the opposition, if they become successful, which we only predict will happen in a high turnout scenario, right, what the priority sheet, right, of Nigerians is around insecurity, around the economy, around jobs, around corruption, and around inflation.
Oh, that's quite interesting. I was hoping we would get, you know, one of our correspondents join us from somewhere, I think Delta States, to let us see what Nigerians over there are saying about this. But of course, I think we'll just limit our conversation to both of us here in the studio. Now, talking about, you know, this, I think, or do you think there's a lot of concentration on the center or at the center, forgetting that we have state governments who are also supposed to, you know, support the people who live within their own domain?
Absolutely right, and I think that's that's probably the only question you asked me in this interview that I'll probably answer with any sense of definitiveness, right? Because we've actually got historical polling from the 2023 and the 2019 election cycles that shows that for likely Nigerian voters, interest in the presidential elections is at almost 100%. Practically every Nigerian, once you think elections, you're thinking Aso Rock, you're thinking who is occupying that seat, you're thinking the APC or the PDP or any of the other, right, opposition parties that have come up, especially in recent election cycles. But when it comes to voter interest in the governorship races, and especially in the National Assembly races and the state legislative races, that interest plummets. I think for 2023, interest in the governorship races was at 23%. For the National Assembly races, it was less than 20%, right? And
what does that even do when interest is plummeting? What's the implication?
I mean, it obviously means that there's an over-concentration on the calls for accountability, right, in the federal government, and not many people realize that things like health and education and infrastructure,
transportation,
right, yes,
really, I want it to be that simple.
Exactly, right, as shared priorities between the federal government and the states. We saw at the tail end of the last administration, power entered that list. You had an extensive conversation with Eyoipo, who is well-versed, right, in the power sector. Now states get to play in that. So In complaining,
many of them have started playing.
Well, yes, but legislatively, constitutionally, and regulatorily, it is there. And I think the point for Nigerian voters is to recognize that state governments, particularly, have a very critical role to play. This is a federal system of government, right, that we run. And who ends up becoming your governor? More importantly, who ends up becoming your state lawmaker, your state representative in the House of Assembly, in many cases is almost as important to your quality of life as if the person who is sitting right and occupying the seat in Abuja, right? So one of the things that we would want to test going forward in subsequent editions of the VST is also to gauge interest in the governorship races, gauge interest in the National Assembly races, gauge interest in INEC, quite frankly, because there's also a significant trust gap, and there are a decent chunk of Nigerian voters that feel that INEC is a part of the reason why they do not trust the outcomes of electoral contests. The idea with the VST is to have a quantitative rolling sheet, just as you have a stock market ticker of how Nigerians are feeling at every stage of the electoral process as the election season.
Do you think this is going to have any impact or any bearing on who emerges as the president of Nigeria? But away from that, I think what's more important for me is for you to answer this question. Do you also think Nigeria is headed in the wrong direction, as your respondents have said? If you can merge the two in 30 seconds, I'll be glad.
You mean me personally?
Yes, you.
Well, I think the most important thing is that a vast majority of Nigerians think that the country is heading in the wrong
And what does Ikemesit think?
Direction. Nigeria could be headed in a better direction.
Okay, political. Okay, all right. Yes. Thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing your thoughts with me.